Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Monday, October 12th, 2020. I hope you guys had a great weekend and your Monday is off to a good start. And on this episode, I've got a status update from the nullification movement. Today, we're focusing on state and local action against the surveillance state, covering issues like automated license plate readers, license plate tracking, cell site simulators or Stingrays, facial recognition, and more. First of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage is where you can find everything you need to follow this show. All the platforms are on, both live streaming video, archive video like library.tv, which is one of my favorites, if not my favorite right now, plus our podcast editions, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeart, all the rest. All those, plus all the archives of the show for over 2 years. On individual episodes, I include all the reference links that I mention in each show. I do my best on that every single time. You can find other ways to follow us, our social media platforms, and even our membership program where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month, and we make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. My great friend, longtime friend, Tom Woods, some time ago, he had said in one of his podcast episodes, he said, look, the 10th Amendment Center has done more than anyone in the world to advance the venerable Jeffersonian tradition of nullification, and that's part of what we're doing today. Thank you for being here. That show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. A quick hello to everyone out in the live chat while I give everyone else a little time to get their notifications on the live streaming platforms. Blue North, Pro-Life, Pro-Liberty, Bob Landry, Tyler B, Patricia Dance, SAH, MRGF, Clay Kent, Setuni, W, Justin Morrison, Lawrence Smith, WC, Michael L, Liberty Howell, Andrew Green, Dan Reed, Madinoff, and good to see you, buddy, and everybody else. I apologize if I missed anybody, but let's get right to this. And I want to start with a report from Mike Meharry this morning. We've been breaking down our State of the Nullification Movement report. It's an annual report that we do. This year, it's about 100 plus pages, 108 pages. It's a free download at 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. I'll mention it at the end of the show as well. But in that annual report, we go over two sections, and it really kind of covers the philosophy of our work here at the TAC as well. The first part is the philosophical foundation, the constitutional history, the application history, the law that we kind of cite as well, the Supreme Court precedents, which isn't real common for us, especially for me here at all. That's in the first half. The second half, the concrete activism, rather than just to talk about this stuff, to complain about problems, we actually work to implement on some major issues, ending the Fed, stopping asset forfeiture, stop gun control, or like today, stopping mass warrantless surveillance, taking actions against that. We actually try to put that in practice according to the founders' principles, Jefferson, Madison, Patrick Henry, and so many others. So from Meharry's report this morning, where he's breaking down the surveillance section of this activism, he starts out with this. He says, although NSA spying, a lot of us think about NSA spying when we think about surveillance, and that's the end of the story. Although it remains the most high-profile warrantless surveillance program, and warrantless surveillance means unconstitutional, and unconstitutional could be federal or state, depending on who's doing the warrantless surveillance, he says the federal government has created a national surveillance network that extends well beyond the operation of this single agency. In fact, the NSA is only, if you really think about the big picture, is a small part of the day-to-day operation and implementation of this surveillance state. He says, in fact, state and local law enforcement have become vital cogs in the national surveillance state. Now, those of you who've watched this show or listened to it for a long time, followed our work, this is easy introductory stuff. But just as a quick breakdown and as a refresher, I want to point everyone to an episode I did back in February of this year covering some great work by the Electronic Frontier Foundation at EFF.org. And that episode is called Street Level Surveillance: Top 4 Technologies and Strategies to stop them. As a quick introduction to what I'm talking about today, and I'm not going to get into much detail on these technologies right now, but it's a good idea to have an understanding of the surveillance technologies that are being used against us. Because the more you know about how they're used, what they are, how the information is passed along, the better we can understand strategies to stop them. If we just think NSA, or we just think they're spying, or it's just social media or whatever, it becomes just kind of big picture talking points, and really the nitty gritty of actually doing something about it goes by the wayside. So I recommend that you check out that episode to get a pretty good overview of how these main technologies work. I will link to that in the show notes. And the short takeaway on this is that even the most local of surveillance, whether it's a drone or a license plate tracker or a red light camera, whatever it is, any contact tracing in schools, it doesn't matter what's happening on a local level. Even if they sell you on the idea that it's only happening on the local level, it isn't. It's really part of the broader national and if not international surveillance network. We have things that are called ISE, Information Sharing Environment, and Fusion Centers. You may have heard of one or both of those. And the basic process is that when someone does surveillance locally, in most situations, unless we take action to stop that on the local level, what happens is the information gets passed to everyone, everywhere. So you could be in a small town in Iowa or Texas or wherever. You'd be in a big town somewhere. Here in Los Angeles, if you happen to come and visit and you want to go see Hollywood or something like that, and you go back home to Idaho or wherever you visited from, when you come home, the information, if you rented a car in your name or whatever, and they have license plate trackers, they can have a map of where you've gone at all times, even if you left your cell phone at home, because they're tracking you. So by banning the technology on a local level, or requiring a warrant to do surveillance, which is a pretty good basic idea based on probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, on and on, or as a very first step, restricting the sharing of data outside of the local area, we can actually have an impact on the overall national surveillance state, because it's not just shared with other local law enforcement, it's shared with DHS, FBI, DEA, and all the rest, the NSA, and on and on. No data means no national surveillance program. So I want to start out with some of these, and the first one I'm going to cover is license plate tracking. They're run by ALPRs, Automated License Plate Readers. A quick overview from Mike Meharry's report. He says, as reported in the Wall Street Journal a few years ago, this happened, the federal government via the DEA, we learned that they were tracking the location of millions of vehicles through data provided by automated license plate readers operated on a state or a local level. Literally millions of people were being actively tracked by the unconstitutional DEA that shouldn't even exist for the crime of getting in their car and driving someplace. And the way it was happening was local law enforcement or local agencies were setting up cameras to protect you, of course. It's always to make sure that your kids are safe. The constant lie, scaring you into fear that you need this or the terrorists are going to come and kill you, is absurd. And we have to have a little bit more backbone in our lives to recognize that the most fearful organizations are the governments that are supposedly protecting us. Side note, can't resist that. But the bottom line is local law enforcement around the country for a decade, we didn't even know this type of thing was happening, but then it was leaked. This is not a Snowden leak, it's somebody else, I forget who. But they had been running at the time about 8 years or so, and now it's up to 10 years. The DEA doesn't have the license plate readers installed, the local people do. Going to our report, just a quick overview of ALPRs. They can scan, capture, and record up to 1,800 license plates pretty darn accurately every minute. 1 minute, 1,800 license plates. And records obtained by the EFF through open records requests encompassed information compiled by 200 law enforcement agencies that utilize ALPRs. The data revealed that more than 2.5 billion license plate scans were done in just 2 years. Of only 200 law enforcement agencies, 2.5 billion scans. And just so you know that this is not for criminal activity, they always sell it to us on their stopping child traffickers or drug runners or terrorists, or, oh, they're getting the bad guys. The stats tell us something completely different. And the report goes on. Perhaps more concerning, this gigantic sample of license plate scans, 2.5 billion over 2 years, it's probably double that, if not more, reveals that 99.5% of this data was collected regardless of whether the vehicle or its owner were suspected of being involved in criminal activity. Less than 1% were actually actively involved in criminal activity. And they use that to be able to they use the fear of crime. Most of the criminal acts, which shouldn't even be on the books, those laws are generally unconstitutional on a state or a federal level anyways, but they use that to scare people into compliance. Like, oh, okay, we're just getting bad guys to protect you and your kids. But it's bull. Going further, Mike reports in his article this morning, currently 6 states. This is a very, very small dent that's being made on license plate tracking. I think it's a huge requirement that has to happen all over, but 6 states have placed significant restrictions on the use of ALPRs. We expect a number more to consider them this year. Those states are Minnesota, Montana, New Hampshire, Utah, Arkansas, and most recently, Nebraska. But even those 6 states need to actually lock it down further. But that's a quick introduction. Next, we want to go to facial recognition. And here's how we cover it. A recent report revealed that the federal government has turned driver's license photos into a giant facial recognition database, putting virtually every driver in America in a perpetual electronic police lineup. The revelations generated widespread outrage, and generally you get a lot of people who are just generally kind of pissed off, and then very little happens about it. And that's why we think it's so important to understand how it gets implemented, how it's used, and the types of small steps that we can take to actually chip away at this. But Mike says this story isn't new. The federal government has been developing a massive nationwide facial recognition system for years. The FBI rolled out its next-gen facial recognition database in 2014, and it was pretty small at the time, but they've been sweeping up photos, and you can be sure that they are adding photos of facial recognition from your favorite social media platform, or they can tap into that, and it gets really, really, really good at it. The report goes on in 2016. The Center on Privacy and Technology at Georgetown Law, which is excellent on this, released a report called The Perpetual Lineup. It's a great name. A massive report on law enforcement use of facial recognition technology in the U.S. That's at perpetuallineup.org. They conducted a year-long investigation and collected more than 15,000 pages of documents through more than 100 public records requests. It paints a disturbing picture of intense cooperation between the federal government and state and local law enforcement to develop a massive facial recognition database. Again, it gets down to the federal government, probably through some unconstitutional grant programs, partnerships, joint terrorism task forces, all the things that I've covered on how the federal government militarizes and nationalizes local police. Local police are no longer local police. They are not your local law peace officer anymore in any respect. And this goes to the smallest town, to the largest, to the LAPD, to whatever. They are all pretty much bad, even though you may have some individuals who really don't want it to be like that. Those are more the outliers than anything. So it's really something, again, facial recognition surveillance is something that's being fueled heavily by state and local law enforcement, collecting the data, passing it along through the ISC, fusion centers, and the like, and then everybody has it, the federal government. Now, of course, we know that airport travel is going to be a huge part of this as well. They are really rolling out aggressive, this came through the Patriot Act and its follow-ups, aggressive facial recognition, and that is not operated on a state or local level, but certainly all the data. With facial recognition, the more data you feed it, the more accurate it becomes. And that's why I generally and strongly oppose going after facial recognition based on the fact that it is really bad on racial data. I don't know how else to put that. I don't know. I'm not the right guy to maybe to really cover it in detail. But the bottom line is it's really inaccurate on people of color. And that's terrible. So people get misidentified because they're black and because the facial recognition isn't good at detecting who's who. Me, white male in my late 40s, yeah, no problem. They're going to get me every single time. But a lot of organizations out there focus only on the race issue, and I think that's a big problem. They say, well, it's not accurate. It misidentifies people of color. But what's going to happen as it keeps feeding more data? You're no longer going to have a leg to stand on when it becomes accurate. And the algorithms, the AI, will absolutely become more accurate in a very short time. And then suddenly, if you've based your entire argument on race issues, everybody's screwed. So we have to just say it's bad, and then the inaccuracies make it even worse. We don't want it to be accurate on anybody. We don't want it to be used, because these types of technologies, whether it's a license plate reader or facial recognition, we're talking about surveilling just anybody anywhere. There is no warrant, there is no probable cause, there is no oath or affirmation, there is no particularly describing the person or place to be searched or seized. Everyone is being searched, and their image is seized, or their license plate. Anyways, Mike covers a little bit more from today's report. He says in 2019, California, of all places, enacted a law that prohibits a law enforcement agency or a law enforcement official from installing, activating, or using any biometric surveillance system in connection with an officer camera or data collected by an officer camera. This also includes body-worn cameras, other handheld devices which they use. And we learned out of this that San Diego, well, we knew for a while, San Diego actually has one of the largest facial recognition programs in the country, if not the largest. There are cameras all over the place, and it's all over body cameras. And because of that law passed in 2019, San Diego, at the beginning of this year, totally dismantled it. Maybe it was the end of last year and then going into this year. They completely shut down the program. Unfortunately, California is one of these places where they focus the opposition. All the people who could have done really great work, instead, they did some good work talking about facial recognition surveillance. But most of the lead organizations really just complained to the legislators that it was really just bad on people of color. And so therefore, instead of having a permanent ban, we ended up with a 3-year ban or 3-year moratorium in the state from 2020 to 2021, 22. My government school math is terrible. Sorry about that. But now we're only got the 3-year moratorium, because I think the legislators were, they took it and ran with it. They took that opportunity. You give them an inch and they're going to take a zillion miles. They took that opportunity to say, well, if you've only got a problem with it being inaccurate, let's give it a few years to get a little bit better, and then we'll re-implement it. That's what I think is going to happen here in California. It'll probably be really bad and kind of lead the way for everybody else. So ignore that approach, please, in your own area. Washington State, Mike writes, passed a bill, I think that was just earlier this year, that would require a warrant for ongoing and real-time facial recognition surveillance. Now, some people at Georgetown, the organization there, they were concerned about the day-to-day use of this rather than just ongoing. They think there's a legal loophole, so we're going to have to work on that to tighten it up there in Washington State. New York State actually passed a bill that would place a moratorium on the use of facial recognition in schools. That was actually just passed. It is pending on the governor's desk right now for a signature. It's going to take a lot of pressure. I mean, it's surprising that that actually got passed out of the legislature there, but let's just take what we can get and build on it. Mike also points out that there's been a large number of local facial recognition bans implemented in the last year, primarily here in California and also in Massachusetts. So we're seeing local level action in places like Boston, San Francisco, Berkeley, Oakland, and elsewhere. And yes, almost every single place is very, very much to the far left end of the spectrum that is restricting facial recognition surveillance. And it should be, rather than, unfortunately, what we hear from conservatives when they see this is just something negative. They complain about the fact that they've restricted surveillance there, and maybe it's because they're feeling insecure that these guys who are just terrible on so many civil liberties issues, on so many issues of liberty in the Constitution, are actually on this particular issue doing far better than anyone on the right, any conservative. I think it's because the right-leaning groups are so on board with this thin blue line garbage that they don't want to do anything that pisses off cops, because the cop organizations, the lobby groups, the unions complain very hard when you try to restrict their ability to spy on people without a warrant. They say we're all going to die, basically, if they have to follow their state or federal constitution in any way. Anyways, going on, let's take a look at the next section on this. Stingrays, or cell site simulators. Mike writes, these are portable devices used for cell phone surveillance and location tracking. They essentially spoof a cell phone tower, tricking any device within range into connecting to the Stingray instead of the cell tower. And these can be either a hardware type of a box that's carried around, and some places still do that. Most places do this as just a piece of software on a laptop or on a cell phone that they can actually do this. It allows law enforcement to sweep up all communications content within range of that tower. So if you're in a place like LA, your phone is literally just connecting to a cell phone tower at all times. And so what they're doing is they're actually getting in between with this cell site simulator. The cell site simulator thinks it's connecting to the cell phone, but it's really getting all the information downloaded into the COPS database. That gets passed along through fusion centers and ISE to all the federal agencies and all other local agencies around the country. In 2019, Mike writes, New Mexico barred warrantless Stingray spying in a piece of legislation called Electronic Communications Privacy Act. It requires police to obtain a warrant or wiretap order before deploying a Stingray device, unless they have the explicit permission of the owner. And that really limits to almost zero the practical application of this. If you have to have a warrant, and the warrant has to be based on probable cause and describing the person, can you have a warrant that covers everybody? Well, they'll probably look for a way, but what we're doing is we're making it more and more difficult for them to do this kind of indiscriminate surveillance. In 2020, they expanded that law. And again, this is an example of how you start with something that is not the end game. That is not the end, just, warrant or wiretap order. We really want them to not use this at all, because I don't believe they can use these types of technologies that targets just one individual. If they ever find a way to do that, then you can have a warrant based on probable cause describing the person, place, or thing to be searched or seized, and then everybody else isn't swept up in it. And that's actually effective law enforcement if you're going to do it as well. The needle in the haystack approach is really just bad strategy too. So in the 2020 session, New Mexico expanded protections under that 2019 law by limiting the retention and use of incidentally collected data. So they recognized, like, look, okay, now you're just telling us we're collecting this information by accident. It's just incidental, and we're really just using the warrant. So then they have to follow up and say, well, now you can't share that data either. So it's piece by piece. We're always going to be struggling to fight against them because they always want to find the loophole, but it's certainly becoming more difficult in New Mexico. Also in 2020, of all places, the Maryland legislature passed a bill to ban warrantless Stingray spying, completely bans it, by adding provisions to existing statutes limiting warrantless location tracking through electronic devices. 2 other states also expanded protections against this type of thing in electronic data more generally. We have Utah and Illinois both passed legislation in the last year to restrict the collection and sharing of electronic data. Next up, I want to cover drones just very briefly. In our report here, it notes that they can be equipped with technology allowing them to intercept cell phone calls like a Stingray. They can determine GPS location. They can gather license plate information. Basically, a drone can be equipped with any of these types of technologies. They just plop it on there, hook it up to the camera, or if it's sending a feedback and it's something that's analyzing the license plates or the facial recognition back at a central hub like a fusion center, all they need is a good camera. That's it. They can be used to determine whether individuals are carrying guns. We know that they use heat sensors and things like this as well, so it's a gun control tool as well. Synthetic aperture radar can identify changes in the landscape, such as footprints and tire tracks. Some drones are even equipped with facial recognition. I expect a lot more in the near future. According to research from the Center for the Study of the Drone at Bard College, 347 U.S. police, sheriff, fire, and emergency response units acquired drones from 2009 to early 2017, primarily sheriff's offices and local police departments. And in response, we've seen 19 states. We've had a lot of movement on this earlier on, but it's kind of tapered off a little bit. But we've got Alaska, Florida, Idaho, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Kentucky, Maine, Montana, Nevada, North Carolina, North Dakota, Oregon, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Vermont, Virginia, and Wisconsin now have some level of restrictions. I think they're all way too small, but there is a foundation built there to take the next step. As Thomas Jefferson wrote in the 1790 letter to his friend, the Reverend Charles Clay, the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. And that's what we're doing here for sure. Now let's go back to the NSA. The NSA is not untouchable, I'll tell you that. And you should know this by now, hopefully, if you've ever followed us. If you're brand new here, this might be new to you. But Mike puts in his report here, in 2014, the TAC dove headfirst in the fight against unconstitutional federal surveillance. That's kind of redundant. When it spearheaded efforts to turn off the water at the NSA facility in Bluffdale, Utah. and cut off other critical state and local services to other NSA facilities. It isn't just Utah. We haven't, Mike points out, turned off the water in Utah. Got pretty close, but then the military sent people out to warn them against it. But we did win some victories. In 2014, of all people, former California Governor Brown signed SB 828 into law. It was the first state that actually took this approach and passed into law. It needs follow-up to actually be implemented, but there's a foundation there, and we're going to probably try to revisit that here in California soon. In 2018, though, Michigan built on this foundation with the passage of HB 4430. That law prohibits the state and its political subdivisions from assisting, participating with, or providing material support or resources to a federal agency to enable it to collect or to facilitate in the collection or use of a person's electronic data without a warrant or under a few other carefully defined exceptions. The bottom line on the NSA, a lot of people tell us, oh, this is really an interesting idea. The facility in Utah could be requiring 1.5 million or more gallons of water per day to operate, to keep the supercomputers cool. You can't do that. You can't shut down a federal agency by turning off resources like water or electricity. Well, I did an episode in February of 2019 that covers exactly that. Something that happened in modern times, how one state turned off the water to the feds and won, and even a federal court backed them up, which is really surprising. I will link to that in the show notes. It didn't get a lot of views. This was a little bit earlier on in the show, and maybe I didn't do an awesome job, but I think the story is really interesting. So I encourage you to check that out. I will link to that at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And just one quick reminder here as we wrap up here. Again, this is just a small piece of our State of the Nullification Movement Report. You can read and download the entire thing. It's free. We aren't the type that are going to ask you to enter your email address or your name. You can just get this totally anonymously. If you want to use Tor or a VPN, it doesn't matter. You can still access the website. Tor, you might have some difficulties, but we have a lot of security restrictions on the site. But you can download it without sharing who you are. 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. We have a Kindle version, PDF. We have Apple and Android for their books editions as well. So please check that out. You can understand the overall big picture of how this is done, the philosophical and constitutional legal foundation, and then how it's being implemented, not just on surveillance, but on other issues as well. Before we head out of here today, I want to take a quick look over in the live chat again. Clay Davis, good to see you. Clay says, when someone shuns the importance of protecting privacy by saying, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, it is essentially the same as saying the right of free speech isn't important if you have nothing to say. Well, you know who has something to hide and something to fear, and that's the government. We need more cameras pointed on government at all times, not on the people. So hopefully people will turn that around. Appreciate you mentioning that, Clay. Madanoff, yes, very cool about Michigan. A lot of people actually complained about that. Self-proclaimed constitutions complain that Michigan would actually do something to follow the Michigan state constitution and not participate in federal surveillance. I mean, you can come up with whatever garbage you want just to be a partisan. Not you, Madanoff, but some people are just so partisan that they can't even set aside the fact that maybe some opposing state or some opposing political team did something when it's right. What we want to do is encourage people to do more right things, and then we can attack them on all the other garbage. But yes, we certainly want to give people a pat on the back when they do something right. DL Neal says, don't forget about traffic shaping. This is something I don't know about. Okay, let me read this. There is a strategy that sends chunks of American data overseas. Oh, yes, yes. So when I talked about this, yes. So what they're doing is when you have a phone call, for example, because it's voice over IP, if you're calling someone, I'm in LA, if I'm calling someone in New York, or if I'm calling someone in Vegas, for example, the phone call, the data packets probably travel over to London and then Albania. And then because it's all cloud-based infrastructure, it's bouncing all over the place. And then through Section 702, the feds can tap into that as well. So they're tapping into all kinds of stuff on the federal level. And that's actually really, I didn't know that was the right term for it, DL. So thank you for pointing that out. Andrew Green, good to see you as well, says, wow. Taking a look a little further. who do they restrict it from? Do the feeds still go to DHS? State might not do facial recognition, but the feds will against the feed. So if they are not sharing the data, if they're not, first of all, they shouldn't be collecting it. We want to stop them from using the tool. So in San Francisco, for example, they totally banned facial recognition use by government. So that's the best way. Just ban them because they can't be trusted. Government cannot be trusted with this type of technology. They never use it right. If we ever get to the point where we're not living under the largest government in the history of the world or close to it, we certainly are the largest by far right now. If we ever get to that point, then maybe at that point it's worthwhile to say, okay, you've been trustworthy for the past century. No, that's a bad idea too. Never trust government. They're always going to want to expand their power. So you want to, first of all, again, you want to stop them from using the technology because they can't be trusted. Second of all, if you can't do that, require a warrant based on probable cause, because that makes it far more limited when they're even going to collect the data. Then you want to restrict the sharing of data if they actually collect it. And all these things, and even though there are ways around some of it, it makes it far more difficult. And if they're going to be able to share 100% of the data without any restrictions versus 90%, 95%, I would take a 5% reduction, a 2% reduction at this point because it's so bad. But if we can get down 50, 60, 70%, 90%, then we're talking huge leaps forward for liberty that are a great foundation for going further. Hopefully that makes some sense. Taking a look and see if there's any other interesting... Archangel for Truth says, have you heard of the recent decision made by the Supreme Court? If you share anything with third parties, then we cannot claim that information is private. I don't know about a recent Supreme Court opinion. Most of them suck. But yes, they generally take the opinion, and through the incorporation doctrine, they will take a local case and have bad precedent and then force it on everybody. And then all the locals and all the other states will follow that bad precedent. And just scrolling a little bit more... biometric concerns. I'll take a look a little bit further. There's a lot of interesting back and forth here, and I really appreciate all those comments. If you like this information, you found it, well, educational, and that's most important. I think it's actually encouraging that even in this climate today, we're seeing some small positive steps forward. We have to get every single one we can and move forward from those. That's my view. That's the way I approach it. I recognize that we're literally looking at a struggle for liberty, the constitutional liberty, that goes well beyond my lifetime. But I feel my duty, my obligation to do what I can to set the stage for people, generations in the future to build off of. And so I feel really good about some of these small steps. I recognize that they are sometimes overwhelmed by so many bad steps, but we're going to continue pushing forward no matter how much the odds are stacked against us. If you support this goal, you support our work, you support this mission, there's some free things that you can do very quickly to help us spread the word. Smash the like button, reviews on Apple Podcasts, Podbean, or whatever podcast platform you may be on. Comments later on in the archives, subscribing, getting notifications, all these things trigger the algorithm of the platform you watch or listen on, and it tells the platform to show the program to more people. You can also sign up to join us as members, as I see a number of people out there that I'm so grateful for. I don't want to name any names. I'm not doxing anybody, but I see a lot of you guys out there. You know who you are. Thank you so much for putting your financial faith behind our work. You are the backbone of our ability to be able to do this day in and day out and expand our reach to more people all the time. You can join them for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And I really appreciate you being here today. Again, I hope you had a great weekend. I hope your Monday's off to a good start, and I'll see you next time here on the path to liberty.